Gretchen Barretto is already one of the Philippines' most famous celebrities, but behind her glamorous image is a family name tied to one of the country's most powerful dynasties. The Cojuangcos built an enormous fortune spanning business, land, politics, and generations of influence. And once you discover just how deep that fortune runs, Gretchen's connection to the family takes on a completely different meaning. Because behind the celebrity lifestyle is a dynasty whose wealth and influence stretch far beyond what most people ever see. Chapter 1. The man behind Gretchen's glamorous life. For decades, Gretchen Barretto has been one of the most recognizable women in Philippine entertainment. But behind the designer clothes, glamorous events, and carefully photographed lifestyle is a relationship that has connected her to a family whose name carries far more weight than celebrity alone. That relationship began with Antonio Tonyboy Cojuangco. Gretchen and Tonyboy have been together since the 1990s, and their relationship has lasted for more than 3 decades. They have one daughter, Dominique Cojuangco, but unlike many celebrity couples, they never turned their relationship into a traditional public marriage. Instead, they built a life together largely on their own terms, and that alone would make their story interesting. But Tonyboy wasn't simply another wealthy businessman. He was born into the Cojuangco family, and that surname changes everything. Tonyboy's father was Ramon Cojuangco, one of the major figures in the history of Philippine long-distance telephone company. Ramon became president of the company and helped establish the family's position in one of the Philippines' most important corporate institutions. So when Gretchen entered Tonyboy's life, she wasn't simply becoming involved with a successful man. She was stepping into a family with generations of business history behind it. That distinction is important because the Cojuangco name is attached to several different fortunes. There is no single bank account called the Cojuangco fortune. Different branches of the family accumulated different businesses, properties, investments, and inheritances over generations. Some became associated with agriculture and sugar. Others became major figures in telecommunications, banking, manufacturing, media, and other industries. Tonyboy belonged to one of those branches. And over the years, he built his own business career while remaining connected to the family's established corporate world. For Gretchen, that created a very different environment from the one she had known through show business. Her career had made her famous, but the Cojuangco name represented something older. It represented inherited relationships, corporate connections, family history, and access to circles that existed long before Gretchen became a household name. And yet, Gretchen was never simply hidden behind Tonyboy's surname. She had already established her own identity. She became known for her fashion, luxury lifestyle, philanthropy, social connections, and highly visible presence among Philippine high society. Her relationship with Tonyboy simply placed her at the intersection of two worlds that rarely appear together in quite the same way. One was a celebrity, the other was established wealth, and their daughter, Dominique, became the bridge between them. Born to Gretchen and Tonyboy, Dominique grew up with a famous actress and social figure as her mother and a businessman from one of the Philippines' most prominent families as her father. But what makes the story especially interesting is that Gretchen's connection to the Cojuangcos did not begin with a business deal or a family inheritance. It began with a relationship, and for more than 30 years that relationship has remained one of the most closely watched private lives connected to Philippine high society. Still, knowing Tonyboy's surname isn't enough to understand the world Gretchen became part of. Because the real question isn't simply whether Tonyboy was wealthy, it's where that wealth came from. The Cojuangco family had been building its economic position for generations before Gretchen ever met Tonyboy. Their story reaches back to a Chinese immigrant who arrived in the Philippines in the 19th century, followed by decades of expansion into agriculture, sugar, land, telecommunications, and other industries. And eventually, that accumulation created a dynasty with multiple powerful branches. So before we can understand Gretchen's glamorous life today, we have to understand the fortune that existed long before she became connected to it. Because Tonyboy didn't build that world alone. He was born into it. Chapter 2. The Fortune He Was Born Into. Tonyboy Cojuangco may be the man who connected Gretchen Barretto to the dynasty, but he did not create the foundation of that dynasty. To understand what stood behind his surname, we have to go back several generations. The Cojuangco family's roots in the Philippines go back to the 19th century, when Co Yu Hwan, a Chinese immigrant from Fujian, settled in the country and became known as José Cojuangco. Over time, his descendants established themselves in central Luzon and expanded their commercial and agricultural interests. But the family's transformation into a major economic force accelerated under José Cojuangco Sr. He was not simply a landowner. He was a businessman, banker, politician, and one of the key figures behind the family's expansion. The National Historical Commission of the Philippines records that he founded and became chairman of the Philippine Bank of Commerce in 1938 and later became closely involved with Hacienda Luisita. Then came the deal that would define much of the family's modern history. In the 1950s, the Spanish company Tabacalera decided to sell Hacienda Luisita, a vast agricultural estate in Tarlac, together with the Central Azucarera de Tarlac sugar mill. José Cojuangco Sr. wanted it. But acquiring an estate of that size required more than ambition. The purchase involved financing from the Philippine government. The GSIS approved a 5.9 million pesos loan for the hacienda, while the central bank helped facilitate dollar financing for the acquisition of the sugar mill. The arrangements came with conditions concerning the eventual distribution of the estate to farmers. On April 8, 1958, José Cojuangco Sr., through the Tarlac Development Corporation, acquired Hacienda Luisita and the Central Azucarera de Tarlac. That single transaction dramatically expanded the family's economic position. They now controlled a huge agricultural estate and a major sugar operation. And sugar was serious business. Hacienda Luisita was not simply valuable because of its size. Its connection to sugar production gave the Cojuangcos a powerful position in one of the country's most important agricultural industries. But there was another consequence. The estate would eventually become one of the most controversial properties in Philippine history. The conditions attached to the original financing became part of a decades-long dispute over land ownership and agrarian reform. The land remained largely undistributed, and years later the issue would become entangled with the political career of José Cojuangco Sr.'s daughter, Corazon Aquino, who became president after the 1986 People Power Revolution. Eventually, Hacienda Luisita would reach the Supreme Court. In 2011, the court ordered the distribution of agricultural land to qualified farm worker beneficiaries and revoked the estate's stock distribution arrangement. But that controversy is only one part of the story. What matters for Gretchen is what happened in between. Because the Cojuangco family did not remain dependent on one estate, the wealth accumulated through earlier generations created a platform from which different members could pursue their own businesses and investments. And this is where the family's fortune began to multiply. One generation established the foundation, the next expanded it, and eventually, different branches of the family would enter industries ranging from telecommunications to banking and manufacturing, creating fortunes that were no longer dependent on agriculture alone. That is the part of the Cojuangco story that matters most when we look at Tonyboy. He was born decades after the family's first major expansion, into a branch that had already developed its own corporate history. So when Gretchen became his partner, she wasn't simply entering the life of a wealthy businessman who had suddenly made it big. She was entering a world built on generational capital. The companies, relationships, and opportunities surrounding Tonyboy existed within a family history that had been accumulating for generations. And that changes the meaning of the luxury associated with Gretchen's life. It wasn't simply about what one man earned. It was about what decades of family wealth had made possible. But the Cojuangco fortune was about to become much bigger than land and sugar. Because Tonyboy's branch would eventually move into one of the most powerful industries in the Philippines. And that is where the fortune behind Gretchen's glamorous life begins to look very different. Chapter 3. Inside Tonyboy's Billionaire World. Tonyboy Cojuangco did not simply inherit a famous surname. He grew up inside a business environment that had already given his family access to some of the Philippines' most important corporate institutions. And eventually, he built a name of his own. His most significant corporate connection was PLDT, where his father, Ramon Cojuangco, had been a major figure. Tonyboy later became chairman of the company, serving from 1998 to 2004. But what makes his story interesting is what happened beyond telecommunications. Tonyboy moved into media, banking, satellite television, and other investments, creating a business portfolio that extended well beyond the company most closely associated with his family. Then, in 2003, he made one of his most visible moves. A group led by Tonyboy acquired Associated Broadcasting Corporation, known as ABC, the network that would later become TV5. Tonyboy became its president and CEO, taking control of a television operation competing against some of the country's biggest broadcasters. That wasn't a small investment. He was stepping into an industry where influence was measured not only by money, but by reach. Millions of Filipinos could watch the network every day. Under the new ownership, ABC strengthened its news and public affairs operations, upgraded broadcast equipment, and acquired rights to Philippine Basketball Association games. The network was eventually rebranded as TV5 in 2008 after entering a partnership backed by Malaysia's Media Prima. For Gretchen, this gives us a much clearer picture of the world surrounding her relationship with Tonyboy. The wealth wasn't simply sitting somewhere in the background. It was connected to businesses that operated in industries people encountered every day: telecommunications, television, banking, satellite broadcasting, and private investments. But perhaps the more revealing part of Tonyboy's world wasn't any single company. It was the level of access that came with his position. He moved through corporate circles where major businessmen, executives, entertainers, politicians, and influential families frequently crossed paths. And Gretchen was already perfectly comfortable in another version of that world. She had spent decades building her own position in Philippine entertainment and high society. So their relationship wasn't simply a case of a celebrity dating a wealthy businessman. It brought two established social worlds together. Gretchen brought fame and visibility. Tonyboy brought a family name that had been established in Philippine business for generations, and together they became a fixture of the country's elite social scene. That is why photographs of Gretchen often tell only half the story. A designer outfit can show luxury. A lavish event can show status. A glamorous vacation can show lifestyle. But none of those things explain why she had access to that world in the first place. Tonyboy's background does, and yet there is an important line we shouldn't cross. Being Tonyboy's longtime partner does not mean Gretchen personally owns PLDT, TV5, or every asset associated with the Cojuangco family. Those businesses had different ownership structures, different shareholders, and different histories. Even Tonyboy's own corporate interests changed over time. For example, the Cojuangco-led group eventually exited TV5, with MediaQuest acquiring the network from the consortium in 2009 to 2010. So the story isn't that Gretchen married into a single company worth billions and suddenly became its owner. The reality is more nuanced and arguably more fascinating. She became the longtime partner of a businessman whose family had accumulated wealth and influence across generations, and that meant the lifestyle surrounding her was backed by something much deeper than celebrity income. It was backed by family capital, corporate connections, and a social network built over decades. Then there was Dominique. Their daughter grew up with access to both sides of this world, her mother's celebrity and her father's business heritage. That made her position unusual from the beginning. But as Gretchen's public life continued, another part of the Cojuangco story became impossible to ignore. Tonyboy's branch was only one piece of the puzzle. There were other Cojuangcos whose fortunes became even larger, whose political connections became even more significant, and whose names became attached to some of the most consequential events in Philippine history. And once you look at those branches, the meaning of the Cojuangco name changes completely. Because Tonyboy's world was already impressive, but it was only one room inside a much larger dynasty. Chapter 4: The Family That Changed Everything. Tonyboy's story explains the world Gretchen entered. But to understand why the Cojuangco name carries so much weight, we have to look beyond Tonyboy. Because his family tree reaches into some of the most powerful business and political stories in Philippine history. One of the most significant branches was connected to Eduardo Danding Cojuangco Jr., who became one of the country's most influential businessmen through San Miguel Corporation. Danding's rise was very different from Tonyboy's. While Tonyboy became associated with telecommunications and later broadcasting, Danding built an enormous corporate empire around San Miguel, eventually expanding its interests far beyond its famous beer business. But Danding's story also brought the Cojuangco name into politics. He became closely associated with Ferdinand Marcos during the Marcos era and was widely regarded as one of the businessmen who benefited from his proximity to the regime. Then came the remarkable twist. Another branch of the same extended family was moving in the opposite political direction. Corazon Aquino, the daughter of José Cojuangco Sr., became the face of the opposition after the assassination of her husband, Benigno Ninoy Aquino Jr. When the People Power Revolution removed Marcos from power in 1986, Cory Aquino became president. So within one extended family, you suddenly had two figures representing dramatically different sides of Philippine political history. One was closely associated with Marcos. The other became the symbol of the movement that ended his rule. And then there was the property sitting at the center of another major controversy. Hacienda Luisita. The Cojuangcos had acquired the estate and its sugar mill in the 1950s with government-supported financing. Decades later, its ownership became one of the country's most contentious agrarian issues. When Cory Aquino became president, the issue became even more sensitive. Her administration introduced the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Program, yet Hacienda Luisita remained under a controversial stock distribution arrangement rather than simply being divided among farm workers. The dispute continued for years. In 2004, tensions exploded when a strike at the hacienda was violently dispersed, leaving several people dead and many others injured. Eventually, the Supreme Court intervened. In 2011, it ordered the distribution of agricultural land to qualified farm worker beneficiaries and rejected the continued use of the stock distribution arrangement. For the Cojuangco family, this was more than a legal battle over property. It showed how complicated the dynasty had become. Their name could be found in business, their relatives could be found in politics, their properties could become national controversies, and their family relationships could connect seemingly opposing sides of Philippine history. But this is where we need to be careful with Gretchen's story. None of this means Gretchen personally owns the entire Cojuangco fortune. It doesn't mean Tonyboy owns every company associated with the family. And it certainly doesn't mean every Cojuangco business should be added together and presented as one personal fortune. The family is much larger than Tonyboy's branch. What matters is that Gretchen's longtime partner comes from one of the country's most established business families, a family whose different branches accumulated influence in very different ways. And that puts Gretchen's lifestyle into perspective. The glamorous events, the luxury, the social circles, the access. These things didn't appear out of nowhere. They exist within a much older network of wealth and influence. But Gretchen herself brought something into that world that the Cojuangco family could not inherit: celebrity. She was already famous before her relationship with Tonyboy became the defining part of her public image. She had her own career, her own audience, and her own place in Philippine entertainment. So this wasn't simply a story of a woman entering a wealthy family. It was a collision between old money and celebrity. And perhaps that's why Gretchen has remained so fascinating to the public. She represents both worlds at once. The Cojuangco dynasty explains the extraordinary environment surrounding her. But Gretchen's own story explains why that environment became so visible. And after more than 3 decades with Tonyboy, their daughter Dominique has now become part of that story too. Which brings us back to the question that matters most. After all these years, where exactly does Gretchen Barretto stand inside the Cojuangco dynasty? Chapter 5. Gretchen's place in the dynasty. After tracing the Cojuangco fortune back through generations, there is one question left. Where does Gretchen Barretto actually fit into all of this? Because the easiest way to tell her story would be to say that she simply entered a billionaire family and began living a life of luxury. But that would be too simple. Gretchen already had a name of her own long before Tonyboy Cojuangco became the man beside her. She had built a career in Philippine entertainment, developed a highly recognizable public image, and eventually became known just as much for her fashion and social presence as for her acting. Then Tonyboy entered the picture. And what began as a relationship in the 1990s became a partnership that lasted for decades. In 2024, Gretchen addressed years of speculation about their relationship and said they had been together for 31 years and had never separated. She also described Tonyboy as someone who consistently supported her. That longevity is important, because Gretchen's connection to the Cojuangco world isn't a recent development or a short chapter in her life. It has shaped more than 3 decades of it. And their daughter, Dominique, became the clearest link between the two worlds. Dominique grew up as the daughter of a famous actress and a businessman from one of the Philippines' most prominent families. She later studied fashion in California, graduating magna cum laude, and developed her own interest in fashion and business. In March 2023, Dominique married Michael Hearn at San Agustin Church in Manila, followed by a reception at the National Museum of Natural History. Gretchen and Tonyboy were both there, watching their daughter begin a family of her own. That moment quietly showed what the Cojuangco story had become for Gretchen. It was no longer simply about the businessman she fell in love with. It was about the family they created together. And that is perhaps the most important distinction in this entire story. Gretchen did not inherit the entire Cojuangco dynasty. The Cojuangco fortune isn't one giant personal fortune belonging to Tonyboy, and it certainly isn't something that can simply be assigned to Gretchen. The family has multiple branches, separate assets, businesses, and histories. What Gretchen has is something more specific. A decades-long relationship with one of the family's prominent members, a daughter who carries the Cojuangco name, and a life that has existed alongside the wealth and social influence accumulated by generations before her. And that is enough to make her story extraordinary. Because Gretchen has effectively lived at the intersection of celebrity and old established wealth. She brought fame, Tonyboy brought the family legacy, and over the years those two worlds became inseparable in the public imagination. That is why even the smallest glimpse into their private life can attract enormous attention. A family celebration, a luxury property, a fashion appearance, a photograph from an exclusive event. To an ordinary viewer, these might look like displays of wealth. But for Gretchen, they are also glimpses into a social environment she has inhabited for decades. And perhaps the biggest misconception is that her story is simply about marrying into money. She never actually married Tonyboy. They have remained longtime partners, and their relationship has continued without the traditional wedding that would normally define a marriage between two high-profile figures. Yet somehow, the relationship has endured longer than many celebrity marriages. And through Dominique, the connection between Gretchen and the Cojuangco family moved into another generation. So when people look at Gretchen Barretto today, they aren't simply looking at a former actress or a socialite. They are looking at a woman whose life became intertwined with one of the Philippines' most established business dynasties. But the real fascination isn't simply how rich the Cojuangcos are. It is how much history stands behind the life Gretchen has lived. The land, the companies, the political connections, the controversies, the family alliances, the corporate power, and finally, the next generation. Gretchen arrived long after the foundation had been built. But she became one of the most visible people associated with the world that foundation created. And that may be the most revealing part of her story. Because behind the glamour isn't simply a billionaire surname. It's a dynasty that took generations to build, and a woman who has spent more than 3 decades living remarkably close to its center. Gretchen Barretto didn't just enter a wealthy family. She entered a dynasty with a history most people never see. And after decades beside Tonyboy Cojuangco, her connection to that world remains as fascinating as ever. If you enjoyed this video, kindly like, share, and subscribe to Her Status for more stories behind the glamour, wealth, and power of the world's most fascinating families.